In this video, we're going to take that high-level preview that we saw last time of building out this application, and we're just going to dig into building the parts of this application. So we're going to start with building this movie listing page, which means that we'll have to learn how to reach into the database, grab all of the documents that are in the movies collection, display them onto the page using React. And one thing I want to mention before we dive into it that I forgot to mention in the last video is that this version of the application that we're building does not have user accounts yet. So we are going to progressively build this up and we will add that later. But for now, we're just simulating, a single user in this application. But future versions, instead of just being dumped directly on this page, you would be able to log in and then you would have your own data that's associated with your account. So we'd be building something that has a login system and data for each user. Right now, we just have a simple version of our application. There's one movies collection, which is all the data in the application, and it's all one user's ratings. Okay, so getting started, what we need to do is make sure we have our docs page handy. We're going to be referring back to the reading data page as we are building this, and I'll pull up the whiteboard, that little CRUD diagram that we built last time as needed. But to get started, we'll download the starter files and take a quick tour. So the starter files will give you a project that looks something like this, which has a few pages created, a few components stubbed out and created here, and then a folder with the data specific files. So this is how we'll interface with Firebase. That'll be in this file. And there's a helper that I've given you that can actually inject sample data into your database. First things first, what you need to do when you download the starter files is make sure that you run npm install or npm I to install everything that is in package.json. So we have a few things. We have React, React DOM, we have React Helmet, React Router. We also have Firebase installed here, and then some libraries that will give us some icons so that we can have edit and delete in our application. And we'll talk about all of those as we get to them. Make sure that you have your npm install set up here. Whoops. Your npm install run, and then do npm run start. And once you do that, start. I already have one running here. You should see a blank application that has a placeholder for all movies and then has our add form here where we will be able to fill these in. The form's already styled and set up with state variables. So what we're going to really be focusing on is not those basics of setting up the form, but how to hook this up to Firebase. First thing that we need to do is go into our firebase.js file. So what we're going to be doing in this file is essentially what we did in the previous project that was just regular JavaScript, where we were able to initialize our Firebase application. So for reference, I'll pull that up. That was week 2. In our Firestore demo, we did something like this where we imported Firebase. We imported the Firestore library of Firebase to enable that. We set up our config, pulling this from our Firebase project. And remember, your config is going to be different than mine, so you don't want to copy these down. In fact, by the time you're watching this, this application will be deleted. So if you did that, you would have errors in your project. But this gives you the configuration so that your JavaScript can actually reach out and talk to your database with the appropriate credentials. We then initialize our application using this configuration, and then we created a database here. So we used the Firestore function inside of our Firebase library that we imported, and that gives us back a database object that we were able to use. We were able to say like database.collection.add to put something in there, or we were able to say database.collection.get to pull everything that is in that database. So what we're going to try and do is create a file in our project that does this, that creates the database that we can then import into all of our components and other files that need access to the database, because we only need to do this configuration once. So what I'm going to do is grab this from our previous project and bring it into here, our Firebase.js file inside of the data folder. And then we can do two things here. So one, we can export the database as is. Export default, the database here. So now from any other file, we could import that database and then use that database for something. And to demo that, let's go ahead and do that. So I have my Firebase.js set up with that database. So I should be able to go to index here. And if I type in DB, if your project's set up in VS Code, it'll be able to parse that this is something exported from another file. So if I hit tab or enter, that'll auto import. If that doesn't work for you, then just make sure that you do the import up here. Once I have this DB, I can now do this other part of what we did last time, where like we did get all movies. And I can get rid of this DB. I was just using that to get the import to trigger. So this function uses that DB, it grabs all of the snapshots and prints them out. So if I call this and check out my console, I should either see all of the documents in there printing out or an error message. And here we go. I can see all of the IDs and then the contents of each document printing out here. If you're following along and you don't have anything in your database, you won't see anything print out here. So make sure that your Firebase project that you have configured has at least a movies collection with one document in it to actually see something printing out at this stage, and test that, make sure that this is working before moving on. So this is great. We do have something that is set up where we have done the configuration once. This exports the database, so every other file in our project can just import that database and use it without having to worry about configuring that database. The other thing that is useful for us to do is, because we have this collection, db.collectionsMovies, when we call db.collectionsMovies, we get a collection reference that has all of these methods, including the get method. But since we are going to be doing that in almost every instance, because we're always dealing with the movies collection, it makes sense that in our Firebase file, we could actually get a collection, reference to that movies collection. And then what we can do is export that. So now, if we needed to reach into the database directly for anything, we could do that from other files, but we also have conveniently already done this collection movies for us. So other files can just import movies collection instead of importing the database, and then that saves us some typing and also saves us some potential bugs, because if you were doing this in every file in your application and in one of them you forgot the E, you made a typo, that file is going to break because of that typo. But if we do it in one place here and we make sure that it's right, when we import it to our other files, we get this reference to the collection, and it's impossible for us to make a typo. So we know that this collection will work as long as we have typed it correctly here. And up until this point, we have only been using the export default syntax, which when you export something as default, when you go to import it, like we have, let me bring these up side by side. Got this, and let's grab our Firebase. Oh, whoops, no, I want index and Firebase. Okay, so over here from Firebase.js, we export the DB, and then we can import that like this. So when there's only the default export, you import it just like this, how we've been doing with all of our components. When you used what is called a named export, where you open up curly brackets and you can put in a bunch of things into these curly brackets to export them, you are, instead of exporting them as the only thing that's exported, you are saying, here, I'm going to export a series of named things. So if we wanted to bring in movie collection into this file, what we do is open up our curly brackets, and then we have to type movie collections to bring this in. And then instead of saying db.get, we can say movie collections.get. And if I check it out, we still see everything printing out into our file, into our console. So this simplifies our code that we use elsewhere and allows us to sort of cut down on typos. There's a lot more to the import-export syntax that we've been using, and I'm just kind of grazing over that topic so that we can have something simple working here, but I will make sure to link some resources to the import-export syntax so that you can read a bit more about it, because there are some more powerful features that we're not using here. And one thing that I want to do before moving forward from here is I can see that I made a typo. This is not multiple collections. This is the movies collection. So I'm going to change this to collection. I'm going to change this export to be movies collection. And then up here, I need to make sure that that matches exactly the name that we export. When we're using these named exports, we have to make sure that the names match. So if I save this and fix this, we should see everything. Whoops. Movies collection. Let's make sure I saved both of these. No, I did not save both of them. Okay, here we go. So now it's working again. Everything's back to normal. We're getting all of that data from our database. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do in this data folder before we start moving on to the React application is show you that there is a JSON file in that data folder here that has a bunch of sample data that we can load up into our application so that, you know, if we were spinning up a new database for this project, we could have some sample application that would help us mock up the user interface before we get to the point where we actually sort of like built the whole flow where you could add data. And we did this last time by just entering things manually, but now that we're doing it, we know how to use code. We could load this JSON file into our application. And I've provided a function that does that. So this load sample data file, it exports as a default the load sample data function. And what this does is go through each element that is in our sample data JSON. So this JSON is an array of objects. So what it's doing is mapping over each element and then calling this add movie function, which does a database operation. So it's getting the title, rating, and release year from that JSON data. It is talking to our movies collection. It is searching for things using a query, which we haven't talked about yet, but this allows us to search for titles that match whatever title is in the JSON, and release year that matches whatever is in the JSON, and then get that snapshot. And what it does is check whether there's something there. So if there's something already there, we'll use that snapshot. We'll get our document from it, which is here. And if that snapshot is empty, we will go ahead and create a new document. And then what it does after that is call the set, which updates that document. So what it's doing is looking through our database to see if there's a match. If there is a match, we will use that reference and we will just override what's there with what's in our JSON. And if there is no match, we'll create a new document and we will put our JSON data into that document. So the way that we can use this is if we go to index.js, let's comment this out. And I want to load all sample data. And here I'm just having the auto import pop up by hitting Control space at the end and selecting that. If that's not working for you, you just need to make sure that you go ahead and import that from our data, load sample data file. So once I've got that, I can invoke this, and anytime our application loads, so if we hit refresh, this function should run. So if I go to my database here and let's say I delete this collection, so it's empty, and I come back to my application and refresh it, that load sample data is running. And if I look back and refresh my Firebase console, I should see my movies collection with all of those pieces of data in it. So as you're developing your own projects, I really would recommend that you take the time to set up some mock data that you can inject into your database at any point in time, which gives you a clean slate for doing some development work. So you don't have to worry about coming in here and adding things constantly. If you have this automated process, then when we get to the point of like deleting movies, we have a bunch of movies that we can safely delete because we can always come back and re-inject all of this data later and get back to a clean slate. Okay, so that's it. I think I'll end this video here where we are just setting up our Firebase configuration. So we still have not touched React, but what we have done is set up our configuration in a file where the database is created and our collections reference is created so that every other file in our project can bring either of those in. So our components can just bring in the movies collection without having to worry about doing any of this initialization. And in the next video, we will dive into actually doing that. We will start building out that movie listings component.